listening to the Traditional Outdoors Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Steve Angel, and before we get started, I want to take a few minutes to share with you information on how you can enter in the first ever Traditional Outdoors Podcast giveaway. Now, following our interview last week with Cameron Mortensen of the Fiberglass Manifesto, Cameron offered to donate a brand new 8-foot 5-weight Eagle Claw Featherlight fly rod. Now, if you remember from the podcast, this is the same fly rod that Cameron got started with over 20 years ago. So they're still being made. They're a great fly rod and they're still available. Cameron carries them on his website in his store, and he offered one up for us to do a giveaway. Now, following his generous offer, I reached out to a few other people I knew and secured a brand new in the box Temple Forks Outfitters TFO Sea Prism fly reel. It's preloaded with Rio weight forward 5-weight floating line as well as backing. So basically, this is a new ready to fish outfit that would be enjoyed by both accomplished fly angler as well as someone that's just looking to get started. Now, the rules for the giveaway are posted on the website, and a link to the rules will be included in the show notes for this episode as well. So if you're not sure about something, re-listen to this intro or look for the rules on either the website, or we'll also do announcements on Facebook and Instagram as well. Now, we've tried to keep the rules as simple as possible, but there's a few things we need you to do, and there's a reason behind those, and we'll talk about those in just a second. So basically, here's what you need to do. First, we need you to leave us a new rating and review on either iTunes, Stitcher, or Podbean. And then after you leave that rating and review, send an email to podcast@traditionaloutdoors.com with notification that you've completed a rating and a review, where the review was entered, whether it be iTunes, Stitcher, or Podbean, and the ID associated with that review. Now, this helps us make sure that when we draw a winner, we're sending it to the correct person. So you want to get the email sent to us as quick as possible, because once we get the email, we're going to go verify that review was left. We know who left it, and now we've got a name ready to be entered for the drawing. And that's all you really have to do. Now, however, if you'd like to be entered again and get a second entry into the drawing, then you can also like our Facebook page at facebook.com/traditional outdoors, and then share the content announcement from that Facebook page to your personal Facebook page as well. And include that information in the email when you send it to us, so that we can go and look at your page and make sure that you did share the announcement. Okay, and we'll draw the winner on May 14th. The winner will be announced either that day or possibly on the 15th, the following day. We'll announce that on social media as well as on the website. And it'll also be announced in an upcoming episode, which would probably be episode 10, which will be released on May 20th. Now, a backup winner will also be drawn in the event that the primary winner does not come forward and claim their prize within 14 days. So we're going to wait 2 full weeks, but you'll want to make sure that you monitor social media, monitor the website, and again, make sure you listen to the podcast on the 20th for that announcement, because if you don't claim the prize, then after 14 days, we're going to go to the backup winner. Okay? All right. Now that we've got that out of the way, I'm excited tonight as I'm joined by my good friend Thom Jorgensen for the podcast, and I'm going to start referring to Thom going forward as my co-host at large. Thom is going to be joining Nick and I from time to time, and in some cases, as is the case tonight, Thom's going to be filling in as my co-host if Nick's just unavailable or unable to join me that night. So Thom's been hanging out on the other end, waiting for me to complete that lengthy intro. So, hey, Thom, how's it going, my friend?
Hey, it's going great, Steve. Thanks for inviting me to participate and come on and chat tonight. Appreciate it.
Absolutely glad to have you. Been actually looking forward to getting you on one of these really ever since we started. So I'm glad it finally worked out. But I know you've been kind of busy as I have. So I'm hoping things are slowing down just a little bit for you.
Yeah, I've just wrapped up about a month of pretty serious business travel, and now I've got several weeks to catch up on things around here and hopefully unload a tote full of wet hunting gear here before too long. We'll circle back on that in a little bit.
All right, sounds good. So for those that don't know you from the podcast, I think Nick's mentioned you once or twice, and I probably have as well. But you and I have shared quite a few adventures in a relatively short time. So I guess I've known you for a while, but for the folks out there that are listening that really don't know who Thom Jorgensen is, I guess jump in and give us a little background of I guess going all the way back to when you were a kid. How'd you get started in the outdoors, and what are your outdoor passions?
Okay. So I was born in Montana. I think when that happens, you're going to end up with outdoors being pretty deeply embedded in your being. At least I hope so. So, born in the 70s, Northwest Montana. Started off fishing very, very young. Got involved with Boy Scouts as soon as I was able. Spent a lot of time outdoors with the family and extended family. So, really earliest memories were out of doors. Grew up hunting. We definitely harvested a lot of animals, filled a lot of freezers, ate a lot of game meat. Very involved in the outdoors up through when I graduated high school. And right after that, I joined the Army. I served in the infantry for a number of years. And upon my completion of service, I moved back out to Montana and then Washington State for a little while. So that would have been around the mid-90s. And spent quite a bit of time fly fishing and hunting over a couple of years. And then the job career thing brought me to Michigan. And I've been based out of Michigan for almost 20 years now. Several of my projects have taken me far and wide. So I spent 1 year living in Colorado. So I did get a lot of extra fishing in that year. But as a career thing, kind of hit a good spot. I've definitely been supplementing back in a lot more hunting and fishing and other pursuits. So it's been a pretty blessed life thus far.
So when you were growing up, did you do a lot of bow hunting back in those days, or was it mostly around firearms? Or
so, yeah, some really awesome early memories. I got a garage sale Bear fiberglass longbow. I was probably way too young to have one, but by today's standards, and a big old quiver full of arrows. I don't know, maybe a 6 or 7. Definitely a don't shoot your eye out kid sort of thing. Glad everything worked out well. But so I started shooting bow real young. And by the time I took hunter's safety, I think that was like 7th or 8th grade. It was done at the school. Talk about the good old days. Everybody I knew hunted with rifles. One friend of mine did stay for the extra days and took the bow hunter's education and bought a bow, and he did hunt with it. So one of my close friends did bow hunt a little bit. I don't remember him ever getting anything with it. But no, we would love shooting. I loved hand loading, loved setting up rifles and seeing what I could do long range with them. And then, hunting season was definitely about getting the freezer filled. So in those days, you could get a handful of deer tags and an elk tag and a few other things over the counter, and you just punched the ones you could. And back then, we'd share the meat around between the families that were participating, and heck of a neat way to grow up.
So, Thom, I was sitting here listening. I've never even asked you this, but so going back to those days when you were hunting with a rifle, obviously you've taken deer because you said deer, but elk. Have you ever taken an elk with a rifle?
Never have.
Okay.
No. So the trick with elk hunting, at least in my experience in those days, or, back then there wasn't that many people in Montana. Not like now. Opening day comes out and everybody hits the woods, and a lot of places where you hunt elk is pretty far off the path. And when somebody gets one, it then turns into packing. And so if you don't get one on the first day, like one year, I drew a tag. The first day, somebody else got an elk. A couple days later, gave it a day of hunting, and then a storm broke. The storm was scheduled to go for like 3 or 4 days. I had to be back in school. I think I was like 13 or 14 at the time.
Right.
So my entire elk season was a few hours on opening day and a few hours 4 days later. Like, I didn't have a lot of opportunity. And once the elk were put up, I mean, that was really what we were there for. So, that was the point of it,
Sure. But mule deer, I'm pretty sure you've taken a few of those, right?
Never took mule deer. I
would really?
Always hold out for the whitetail. Yeah, so had some family members that really like to get the big mule deer bucks. Mm-hmm. Certainly I've passed on a lot of mule deer, but I mean, typically the mule deer were farther than I would want to drag them. And they did, in my opinion, this is just me, I didn't think they tasted as good as a whitetail. So
okay.
I would always punch my tags with whitetail.
So the area that you lived in, or at least the area that you hunted in, those overlapping range for the two. Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah. Probably, I might have seen more mule deer than whitetail. Certainly a lot of opportunity, but no, just for eating. This might be controversial, but man, I sure love whitetail does. They just taste so good.
Well, it's not controversial if that's what you prefer to eat. I mean, you were the man behind the trigger, so I get it.
You just never know what people are going to say on the internet these days. But I make no apologies.
Well, good deal. And what about what about antelope? Did you hunt antelope with a rifle or no?
I went out for antelope, did not get one. The year before I was allowed to hunt, so I would have been, 11? That was the last big year where, all the families drew all the tags and went out. And I think it was 5 pronghorn max, I think up to $2 and 3 antlerless.
Okay.
And so, we definitely did it was a lot of work on goats that year. A lot to hang and skin and butcher out. But, no, I never shot one with a rifle. Back then, I think it was like a $5 tag. I bought a tag one year, but then couldn't get to where the pronghorn were. I mean, it was like a 14-hour drive. So it's a pretty big commitment to chase goats.
So basically what you're telling me is you were a Western whitetail hunter, which is pretty cool, actually. So,
you know what? I never thought of it that way. And looking at the scoreboard, I guess that's true.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. So you moved to Michigan. Now, when did because I mean I guess and we'll get in a little bit deeper into that in just a minute, but I guess I've known you since early 2012, so roughly 6 years, and I've never heard you mention anything about hunting with a firearm during that time. So when did you make the decision to basically just pursue game with a longbow? Let's
see. So 2010, I'd hunted one day since 1997 with a rifle.
Wow.
So 1997 was when I got out of the Army and was hunting in Montana. Mm-hmm. Hunted one day in Michigan and just really didn't get it, which is pretty funny now that I think about it. But so 2010, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I got real lucky. I kind of hit the lottery as far as the types of cancer that aren't as bad or as scary. So I was fortunate that way. And, I kind of started looking at the food I was eating, and at the same time, what I was missing in my very busy life that, was really meaningful to me. And I decided that, what I really wanted to do was get back out in the woods more. I've been doing kayaking and fishing canoeing and fishing and other stuff, hiking, but I hadn't really been out. There's something very different about going afield when you're hunting and any other pursuit. And I really missed it.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I was an engineer, right? My job was super duper technical. Everything was super complicated. And I decided, you know what, if I'm going to go out and pursue animals, I'm going to do it with something with no technology. And stumbled on trad gang, and I was hooked. I mean, from then on, I needed a longbow.
Very cool. Very cool. So we both have a background of hunting with, more than just the longbow. I was talking to Nick about this a couple of weeks ago, and, I grew up hunting with pretty much anything that I could pursue whitetail with. I was out there I started with a bow. Soon after started hunting with a rifle, and then sometime probably within a few years, I actually purchased a muzzleloader kit and put that together and started hunting with black powder as well. So at some point we'll have to sit down and dive a little bit deeper into the whole weapons discussion, because I think there's probably some good dialogue there. It sounds like we've got some similarities in our background there, but I do want to shift gears just a little bit. So I mentioned that we met in 2012. It was actually, I don't remember the exact weekend, but I know it was in February. We were both, it was my first trip. I think it was your second trip, but we were hunting at what was at the time called Hog Heaven, but now it's Wild Things in South Carolina. And I'm pretty sure you remember that hunt.
Oh yeah, very well.
So I guess I'll kind of jump in here and go first, because it's a bit humorous. It, back in those days, the gentleman that ran the operation had everybody meet at a little hardware store there in Estill called Wiggins, and that's everybody bought their license, right before they went to do the hunt, and I remember pulling up to that hardware store and just going in, standing around. We was actually waiting because I had never met anybody, including the gentleman that was running the operation, and I remember looking around, going, all right, so there's a few people standing around in here. I'm wondering if they're all here to hunt hogs or not. And over in the front corner of the store was this tall, lanky guy. And I think you were looking at like a thermocell or something at the time, but I said, yeah, that guy's got to be here hunting hogs, and walked up and struck up a conversation. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Wiggins Hardware. Yeah. We chatted about a few different things, a little bit. I'm like, wow, you're from Georgia, and like, you've seen a hog before. I'm like, this is good. I'm going to pick this guy's brain. You were the pro.
Yeah, and then I ended up following you pretty much the whole weekend, because I'd actually never hunted hogs before, and you had. So, do you remember who? So I remember that Jay St. Charles and Ray Bourbon was there that weekend, and yep. I remember this. I can't remember his name. You may remember his name. The gentleman was there with his son. It was I think it was a state trooper.
Yeah, right? Given his career, we probably don't need to talk too much about exactly who he is, but yeah, it was a father and son.
Yep.
From New England area. Yep.
And then there was another guy from North Carolina there. And I can't remember his name, but I just remember that's the people that were in camp. And I'm trying to remember, did anybody even get a hog that weekend?
Mm-hmm. Yep. The guy from North Carolina, the last morning, it might have been after you left, he got a just beautiful red hog with black spots.
Yeah, it seems like it was after I left, and I found out about it later. But I know I actually saw a few hogs. I never dropped the string that weekend, but I know we spent a good bit of time chatting as we walked, because we walked everywhere back in those early hunts, and spent a good bit of time talking there, and I don't know, just I guess I figured out pretty early that you were a guy that I could really spend some time hunting with and have a good time. And then, as it turned out, we ended up. I don't remember if you knew Nick at that time or if you ran into Nick later. Maybe you remember that story, but I don't.
Oh yeah. I knew Nick. I think we should save this conversation for when Nick's on to defend himself.
Okay, we then there's got to be a good story there. So yeah, we'll shelve that one till we can get Nick on. But I know that I hit. So in the meantime, I ran into Nick online. Was starting up the Simply Traditional thing, and then come to find out Nick knew you. And then that led to the first hunt that we did here in Georgia, which again we'll leave that story for another time when Nick's on to defend himself. But we've hunted wild things now. I'm guessing 4 or 5 times together, probably. I'd have to sit down and add it up, but it's been quite a few.
4 come right off the top of my head for sure. Yeah.
Right.
I think there's probably 1 or 2 more in there too.
And then
it's a great piece of property. And I tell you what, the 2 things I'll remember about the first trip that really stand out. And I don't know if I told you this or not, but I mean, I'd spent months researching and weeks preparing, and I had everything perfect. And I've been studying about hogs and their anatomy and all of this. You know, I was feeling like I had a pretty good fix on them as an animal. I was just trying to figure out how to hunt them. And I knew their nose was so good, you know. I stopped at some little gas station off from Highway 3, all the way up there by Gaston, South Carolina. And the nozzle malfunctioned, and it ended up pouring gas down the side of my car. And when I was trying to, as I was stopping it, I grabbed the paper towels. I ended up soaking my hands and my clothes in gasoline. And all I can think is that I've ruined my chance on this hunt, because there's no way I'd get the smell of gasoline out. And so on that trip, the 2 things I bought at Wiggins Hardware was a little 4-inch mill bastard file to sharpen up my broadheads, and a bar of lava soap. It was the only soap they had in the store, and I just hoped it would cut through the smell of gasoline.
And was that the first hunt, or was that the hunt that I was?
That was the first time. No,
okay.
you were there. So I'd already picked up the soap and the file, and you're right. I was looking at thermocells, because I just bought one, and that was when they went from the twist style to the slider, or vice versa.
Yep.
And the Wiggins actually had newer ones than I had with me, and I was contemplating if I should buy an extra. And I was like, it's February, it's going to be cold, I probably shouldn't need it. And
now you smelled like gasoline. No mosquito was coming near you.
Yeah, true.
I honestly don't remember. I don't remember you smelling like gasoline. So, but no, I don't guess you ever told me that.
Yeah.
You could have played it off that, you know, you were using some kind of special tactic that as long as the gasoline smell was strong enough, the pigs wouldn't smell the human odor. I'd have probably bought it at that time.
Just not that slick. Yeah, no.
So, yeah. So we've I know. So how many? So I know you've killed several hogs, and one of them I really wished I'd been there for. But so how many hogs have you killed hunting in South Carolina at this point? You have a number on your head?
No, not exactly.
4 or 5 though.
More than that.
Yeah,
I don't think it's 10 yet.
I know it's more than that. I can remember several. And you killed. What was the? So killed an absolute monster there a couple years. Was that been 2 years ago now?
Yeah, that was January. Yeah, January 2016, if I recall. I don't know. Do we start this story today?
Here's what I can tell, and then we'll save the actual hunting story for another time. But I can just tell you that I was sitting I was actually in the bed, had my laptop, my little lap desk up, and was working, and I remember the phone rang, and my wife Lori picked up the phone, looked at it, and said, "This has got to be Thom, because it's Estill." And I thought, well, that's either really, really good or really, really bad. And I just remember as soon as you answered the phone, I said, wow, this is going to be a good story, because you were amped up. And I don't think I've ever heard you that amped up. So that's a good way to leave the listeners hanging on that one, because we'll have to come back to that one.
That was a grand animal, and a long pursuit that took a couple seasons to come to a close. So,
well, we'll definitely leave that and set up. You can let me know ahead of time about how long you think it'll take you to walk through that whole story, because it is a really good story.
Two-parter.
A two-parter. So then I guess the next real big adventure. I mean, obviously we've had quite a few hunts, because we've hunted hogs together in South Carolina. We've hunted hogs together in Georgia. We've hunted whitetails in Georgia and Michigan. And I think you've pretty much participated in every hunt like that. That's kind of been, a group hunt that I've been a part of since we met, except the one where Nick went to Cumberland Island, and it proceeded to, we didn't plan it that way, but we actually went to a barrier island to hunt deer and hogs during a tropical storm. I don't advise it, but other than that, you've pretty much made every one of them. So let's
the only tag I've ever drawn and not hunted. Because I did draw that hunt, and that's the only time I've ever not shown up for a hunt. But circumstances couldn't handle it.
We would have loved to have shared in that misery with you, I assure you, because it was bad. But that's the ones you'll remember. We'll always remember that hunt. But so let's skip forward a few years. In 2016. We both set out to do something that I had been wanting to do for over 30 years, since I was 15, 16 years old, reading my fur fishing game magazines. And in talking to you, found out that it was something that you had tried a couple of times, but you really wanted to make a really strong effort at it. And that was pronghorn antelope.
True. Now, do you remember exactly how that came together?
If I remember correctly, we were actually in a hog camp when that idea sprung to life, or am I remembering incorrectly?
I was pretty darn persnickety when you told me how long you'd been thinking about hunting pronghorn and that you hadn't done it yet. I started to get pretty pushy with you, and I didn't know if it was going to hurt our friendship or not, but I thought, you know what? Life is too short to think about doing anything that long. Got to get on it.
Well, and here's what I'll tell you. If I could go back to 16 years old when I first started dreaming about hunting pronghorn, and somebody could have told me, you know what, if you'll wait 34 years, you're going to have the absolute greatest hunting experience. If you'll just wait, I'd have gladly waited. And that's literally what I think in my mind it turned out to be. So, I do know so here's what I do know. I do know we started the real planning of that hunt in hog camp in the bunkhouse. I do remember that vividly. So we hunted, in Wyoming, kind of in between, I guess you'd almost say it was pretty much between Casper and Glen Rock. would be a close estimation. And we just made that an adventure. that whole hunt was an adventure.
Yeah.
So day one, the hunt for me started on a Friday, and I left Georgia, drove to Indianapolis. And we got to tell about so we rented a car. It was a Dodge Caravan, because I figured that was going to be the cheapest way to get all of our gear between the two of us, because we had actually talked about our antelope hunt was 3 days, and then we had a full week. So we had other possible adventures in the bag. So we had all this gear. So I rented this minivan, dubbed it the Goat Hauler, and headed to Indianapolis.
Yep.
Picked you up that night, and we got a good night's sleep, headed out the next morning bright and early, and left Indianapolis. And I think Kearney, wasn't it Kearney, Nebraska we hit?
Kearney, Nebraska. Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Visited the, was that I guess that was the first Cabela's store?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and it's a real interesting one, because, you can see like where the original building was, and where they added into the parking lot, and where they added onto the back, where they turned the warehouse into a showroom.
It just kept growing.
It's a funny little store. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember walking through it. It was like walking through a maze, because it was like you'd go around what you thought was a dead end, and you'd look and there's an opening, and you go into another section of the store. It was really kind of odd.
Mm-hmm. Great store, though.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Great store. I remember picking up so the Eastern hunter didn't plan ahead well enough. I ended up buying a Columbia jacket there, because it was already cool, having left. And I should state that this was in August, so it was like 140 degrees when I left my house heading to Indianapolis. So, but then we headed into Casper the next morning, and we were actually in camp by, I think it was like 3 o'clock that afternoon. After I don't remember, we lost count somewhere spotting antelope from the interstate, somewhere around 150, I think, is where we stopped counting. So yeah, I was like a kid in a candy store at that point, and hadn't even strung my bow yet. So.
Well, and one thing about that,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken, I think you'd already checked off like 2 or 3 or maybe 4 states that you had never been in before along that trip.
Was it that many? Probably, because I know Nebraska I had never been in, Wyoming I had never been in.
It was just the 2 on the way.
I think it was just the 2 on the way, but we would make up for that later.
Yeah.
So we get into camp. We had a good dinner that night. Can't sleep. I think I might have slept an hour that whole night.
And so ahead. I was going to say, so something about the camp, right? So wall tents, cots, sleeping bags, pretty darn hot. But, you talk about like going from sleeping at home in bed or hotel room, air conditioning, whatever. And now you're in this like dusty, cracking lips, dry, hot air.
Rattlesnakes.
Wait, that part of the story comes later.
I know you'll get to it.
I'll get to it. But it's not like it's an easy place to just fall asleep, right? I mean, you hear, if you're used to sounds of humans, and all of a sudden it's just all coyotes and dead silence, and boy, those starlit nights. I mean, when there were just no clouds up, it could turn from real hot to real cold, and so I mean, not like some of those places where you just flop out and sleep. I mean, it was quite the different experience, than the normal day-to-day life.
No, you could definitely hear yourself think. I remember thinking that first night, the only thing I can hear is you could actually hear the wind blowing through the sagebrush. I remember hearing that. And I remember hearing, just at times, depending on if the wind was the right direction, you could hear the windmill farm. But that one, I didn't notice that as much as some of the other people that were in camp did, I believe, because I heard a lot of them talking about it. But I remember hearing it once or twice.
Man, I wish more people had an opportunity to get away from civilization, just be out in the middle of the sagebrush all alone and really have true darkness and true quiet. We talk about all the places we've hunted, and we've been some fairly remote places, but not like what this trip had in store for us.
Oh no, and we weren't. To be honest, we weren't remote yet. We would,
but on day one, you thought you were.
On day one, I must admit, I did think I was. Like you said, you couldn't. You didn't hear any trucks, automobile. The only vehicles I heard the whole time I was in camp was the ones that the people there in camp were driving or our own. So yeah, it was definitely a new experience, but that's not what kept me awake. What kept me awake was knowing that, I think we had said that day when we drove in, do you remember that one really nice antelope buck that we saw that was laying in the shade? He had actually found a little pocket of shade that the windmill was creating right there on the side of the road. And he was a nice buck.
That was a good buck.
and then we had that other buck that kept hanging around camp. That we would see in the afternoons, just outside of the little building where they had our meals. So yeah, it was that.
He wasn't a big one, but yeah, he was sure pretty.
He was a big one to me at the time. So the next morning we get up. I remember our Cody, who carried us out to our blinds. I remember he was asking us if we'd ever hunted antelope, and you said you had, and I said I had not. And he dropped you off first.
Yeah, he dropped me off at a spot. It was going to be a little water hole, and if you remember, I think, is that the one that as we pulled up we chased the badger out of? That
is the one we chased the badger out of, yes.
Yeah. Yep. So hadn't seen one of those in a few years. That was kind of cool.
They look like they're rolling along the ground instead of running. It's kind of funny to watch them.
Well, and all I could think was, it looked like he was leaving out of the blind the way it looked to me as we were pulling up. I'm like, I don't know if I want to get in a blind that some badger might have claimed for home. But jump out, climb in. I'm like, I think I'm good. And I started working with my bow. I watched you guys drive away, and I was like trying to move my seat. And every time I was doing kind of some draws, just making sure that I had limb clearance. And I kept either scraping the nylon or bumping the frame of the hub. And so I put the message back out to Cody and said, 66-inch longbow is too long for this, need to ask for someplace else. And at that time, I think he was already putting you out to your spot.
And I didn't even know. I do remember looking at that blind and thinking, that looks like it's going to be tight. 66-inch longbow and a 64-inch blind crossed my mind. But so I did not know that he went back and moved you. And he dropped me off. So I'll tell this, and then I'll come back to you and let you go into your morning hunt that first morning. But so Cody drops me off. And I had my bow. I'd carried my own chair for the blind out of when we were hunting blinds over water holes for anyone that hasn't already figured that out. So I had my blind, I had my bow, I had my DSLR camera, I had a tripod, I had all this way more stuff than I needed. But waiting 30 some years, I was planning on capturing every moment I could. Right. So I remember the first thing I did is I opened the door in the blind, because mine was a permanent blind instead of a pop-up. And I looked and shined my flashlight, because at that point it was still not pitch dark, but it was still pretty dark. Shined my light around, made sure there was no rattlesnakes or badgers in my blind. And then I walked out. I said, you know what? I'm just going to kind of get a rough distance, so I stepped off the distance, what I thought would be the furthest shot I could take, just so I'd have it committed to memory. Because same thing you were saying with the it's quiet. You're not in Kansas anymore, Toto kind of thing. But it's also there's no reference points. There's no trees. There's nothing. And one sagebrush looks like another, and I just knew if I didn't commit to memory where that furthest shot, and I think I stepped it off was like 24 yards, and I'd been practicing 25. I said, okay, I know I can shoot that far, and so I do all of this. I come back and I'm sitting here and I'm going, I'm looking out across the prairie and I'm thinking I can see for miles. And I mean, to one direction, I can actually see the Rockies. And if I'm looking the other direction, it's just flat. And it's basically to the horizon. All I can see is flat. And I'm like, it's going to be 3 hours before I see any animal here. I mean, I can see everywhere. So I'm in no hurry. I'm taking my time. I set my stuff in my blind, I climb in, and then I start getting all my other stuff together. And it must have been maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes in a blind or in a stand, anything seems like an hour. It was probably 10 minutes. I heard noise, and I look out the blind, and there's two antelope standing right out. They were both doe and a yearling, and I'm like, where did they come from? I mean, just 10 minutes ago, I looked everywhere. So I was just in awe. So I quickly got the rest of my gear set up and ready to go so that I could commence my hunt. And with that, I'm going to come back to, so Cody goes back and gets you and then carries you out to your blind.
Yep. So it didn't take him too long. Picked me up and he's like, yeah, I wasn't sure if that was going to be too small or not. I was really trusting you to gauge it. I've got a great spot. We'll just go out there. So we bounce across the prairie. And what you said can't be understated, right? When you're out in sagebrush, there's no reference point. Like I think our bows are an advantage just because we're so used to having to be so close to things. Like if I had to pick between a 40-yard pin and a 50-yard pin and a 60-yard pin out in the sagebrush, I don't know if I could. But pack up and head out. And another permanent blind, quite large. It's probably 10 feet in diameter, maybe, 12, 15 feet tall. It's basically like it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like a water tank with a shooting lane cut into it. So I climb in, sit down, and I look out, and the truck is literally still like right next to me, and I can see all these pronghorn walking in. Like they're 300, 400 yards away,
right?
But it's like just another day on the prairie for them, right? I mean, there's always ranch trucks bouncing around, and you start seeing group after group after group start coming in, and here's 3 pronghorn, and then they go and walk off a little bit, and then 6 more come in, and then a coyote ran in, and I got some great pictures of a coyote coming in to drink and everything kind of being like aware but not really worried about it. And there was like a little feigning going on between this doe and this coyote. It's kind of cool. They're kind of just watching each other. And coyote trotted off. Didn't go too awful far, but it took off. And then some more pronghorn came in. And after these things drank, they would, this is something I hadn't experienced in my previous years of hunting pronghorn. But they'd, back off somewhere between 50 and 100 yards and bed up. So, I mean, as I've got 100, 120, maybe 150 animals that have come in over the course of the morning, they all just back up a little bit and bed down. And they're all just laid out across the prairie, like they're sunning themselves or something. I don't know. But I don't know. There were a few I was tempted by. Quite a few of the bucks weren't quite what I was hoping for. First morning of the hunt, I didn't want to Didn't want to shoot the very first thing I had an opportunity with, even in spite of a couple years of getting skunked ahead of this. Just felt like everything was going to be right. And then all of a sudden it stopped. No new pronghorn were coming in, and all the pronghorn were all just like laying there, not moving, right? It'd been a couple hours at this point, pushing 10 o'clock. And I'm like, okay, well, if we've hit the stall, right, the midday downtime, maybe this is the time to eat some beef jerky, have a sandwich, drink a bottle of water, get ready for the real hot part of the sit. Because in my previous years, something we didn't talk about was had 2 4-day hunts, 2 years in a row, over 100 degrees, all 8 of those days hunting. And there might have been an exception, but I think every day it was in the blinds before sun up and then staying till sundown. And August 15th, that's getting in at 4:30 in the morning and staying until 9 o'clock at night. I mean, it's just brutal, long, hot, which is what I was kind of expecting, right? 10 o'clock. I mean, I'm thinking I'm in it for the long haul. I look up and there's just nothing but fur in front of that window. And I look and it's horns. There's some real good horns on it. The setup was the blind was set next to the pump. The pump poured water into basically a large trough that cattle would typically drink from.
Right.
And then on the low side of the trough, there was a little spillage that would go down into a natural pan, which normally pronghorn feel much more comfortable drinking out of mud puddles rather than water troughs. Well, I look up, and there's nothing but hair, right? Sure enough, there's this great buck, and the story is told different ways, depending if it's me or Steve telling it. But I'm telling you, it was at least a full 4 yards.
Counting the inside of the blind, or no?
Counting the 2 inside the blind, that would be a full 4 yards. So, yeah, I looked. It was just the perfect shot. I took it.
I just remember Thom telling you told me. I know it was the same Thom. I remember something being said about there was a consideration in your mind that you were worried the arrow would not get clear of the bow before it hit the animal. So.
It felt real close.
And,
I guess like 4 yards is really close, right?
It's very close, even in that situation. So before I go back to my morning hunt, what time do you remember? What time it was that you shot?
So here's what I remember. I decided I was going to shoot. I pulled the arrow back and I let her fly. And I remember this feeling like after all these years, like I finally pulled my string back on a pronghorn. Like this was worth the trip. Like this, because at one point I'd sworn off pronghorn hunting. It's like, oh, you just go out there and you sweat for, 16 hours and you do that 4 days in a row and then you get to go home and take a shower. But when you talked about, your journey, I'm like, nope, you know what, Steve, if you're going to hunt pronghorn, I'm going to go with you. I thought, okay, that was it. I finally made it to that point where there's this buck right in front of me, and I shot, and I was kind of so set back by this situation that it dawned on me, like, I better go look and see what trail it took out on. And I stuck my head out of the blind, and there's...
I would give anything to have been sitting on top of one of those little knolls watching this take place.
Oh, yeah. Well, I look, and all these pronghorn all around this water pan are all looking at this one buck that's standing there 50 yards away with wobbly knees. Like, what's wrong with that guy? And I'm just sitting there like, that must be the one that was just here. And then it fell over right there in its tracks. And I'm like, all right, perfect. And the one thing Cody said is, let me know when you have taken a shot. And I'm like, this is my day, right? Tom's day. I send the message over to Cody, and he replies back and just says, sorry, tracking. Be there when I can. Be there soon. That's what he said. Be there soon.
So I think, and I'll kind of outlay how my morning went, but I think if my memory, and I've got it written in my journal, but if my memory's correct, we literally shot our bucks, and we were a little over a mile apart, line of sight, which we didn't know at the time. I found out later by looking at, because I ended up hunting that blind the last day for my doe, but so I had GPS coordinates for both, and that's how I knew how far apart they were. But anyway, I want to say it was like 12 or 15 minutes difference. Without going back and looking, I can't remember if you shot first or if I shot first, but it was literally within 15 minutes of each other that we shot. So, but I do remember when Cody telling me after we had mine, he said, I've got to go get Tom's. I'll be back. This is all he said. So my story is similar, but different. So after my first encounter, I really started watching my surroundings a lot closer. And what I found out was I was actually, if you can be in a depression or in a bowl in the prairie, that's kind of what I was in. It wasn't that I wasn't necessarily in a low place, but there were these little fingers all around me that kind of created almost like a bowl that I was in. And the blind that I was hunting had little slits all the way around it. So I basically just set up a sequence where I would slowly look out each little hole that I could with my binoculars and scan and work my way around. And by the time I got back where I started, it was time to start over again. So, things I remember that morning, I remember and it was cool when we went out, but within seconds of the sun breaking the horizon, I remember hearing the tin, that made up that blind start popping and creaking as it was expanded from the heat, and it got hot really quick. I remember I had a few bucks. In fact, I took some pictures of some bucks, and several people said, you got nerves of steel if you passed on those. And it was probably the hardest thing I'd ever done. And what I'll admit now is it wasn't so much that I was necessarily looking for a bigger buck. I wanted the experience to last a little bit longer. So I did pass on a couple of decent bucks that morning. And I want to say it was somewhere around 10:30, quarter to 11. I was making my little circuit around the blind, and I looked out to my northwest, if I remember correctly, and I saw this buck, and he was standing out about 150 yards and just staring intently at the water hole where I was at. And I put got my binoculars on him, and as soon as I saw him, I said, if he gives me a shot, I'm gonna take it. Real, mass, a lot of mass at the bases, white ivory tips. I mean, nice cutters. He was just a really good antelope. And even as a novice, someone who'd never hunted him before, as soon as I saw him, I was like, this is a really good buck. He must have stood there for, I don't know, at least 10 minutes, literally. All the does that was with him came in to drink, and he stood there staring. And when he, as I was going back and forth looking at the does that were actually drinking, I went back to look for him, and he was gone. And it took me a little while to find him, but when he finally decided to commit, he was on a pretty much a dead run, coming to the water hole. And I'm thinking, now, obviously at that time, I didn't know the experience you had just had. And there was if you looked out the shooting hole of my blind, you could see where a lot of antelope were coming up right to the edge of the water hole and drinking. And I'm thinking, man, if he'll just come up right there, not knowing that that was the experience Thom had had, and there was no way that I was going to get that lucky. So my buck comes in, and literally that where I had stepped off earlier that morning was a good thing, because he literally came to the drinking hole at the furthest point that he could. And initially he was actually facing towards me, so there was nothing I could do but watch him. And there was some other does that came in, and he was kind of milling around, and he finally turned broadside. And I thought, I've got to wait until, he's drinking. I want to wait till his nose is in the water. I felt like that was my chances were better, because I had that little bit extra distance, because it was right at 24 yards. And I remember coming to full draw. I remember picking out the spot at the back of his shoulder that I wanted to hit. And I remember seeing my arrow on the way. And it was like, as soon as that arrow was halfway to the antelope, the only thing I can figure, and I've played this back 100 times in my head since then, is somehow he caught the echo of that noise coming out of the blind from me shooting, because he spun towards me, and I've never had an animal do that, but he spun into the shot. And as soon as this is all happening in my head at light speed, right? I remember the last thing Cody was telling us that morning was, whatever you do, don't shoot him in the shoulder. And with him turning, that's exactly where my arrow was going. And it struck, and it was one of the few times in my life that I literally felt bad for the animal, because it hit him square in the shoulder and just made a sickening crack, which later, and this, you were there, we found out that it basically split the left side clavicle from the knuckle up to the top of the shoulder. What I'd later find out, it actually broke the off shoulder and all but still passed through. But he turned, ran straight away from me about 100 yards, and I watched him go down or lay down, and I thought, well, he'll stay there. And then this other buck started pushing him, and he actually got up and circled back around, almost back to the blind again. He was maybe 50 yards to the left of my blind. But anyway, so it was a fairly quick recovery, and both of us had our first pronghorns on the same hunt and on the ground, and we didn't know it again at the time, but within, I guess, 15 minutes of each other, we'd both shot what turned out to be really nice, actually Pope and Young quality animals. I know I've had mine scored. I don't think you've had yours scored yet, have you?
I'm still waiting for a taxidermist, so it'll happen eventually. The funniest thing is I totally forgot what the green score was. I remember it was good.
It was, I want to say your green score was something like 74 and change. And I think mine was 73 and change, and it lost a little. It didn't lose much. I think it's still 72. I can't remember the exact score now, but it was a nice antelope.
The funny thing for me is in camp when the tape measure came out, and because of course the guide associations and everybody wants to know how many inches an animal is. I remember being pretty exciting, and since then I really haven't cared at all. I think about the memories of the days going up and the days after, and I think about that day in particular, and that's the one part that matters the least. Had to share a lot of these stories with a lot of people, cooking up the pronghorn meat and sharing that with friends, and the stories that we have, we haven't even scratched the surface. You left a teaser about rattlesnakes. We talked a little about the goat hauler. We haven't talked about the road. There's so much we haven't talked about it all. And it was all just a few days, but
well, I tell you,
34 years in the making, apparently.
Yeah, it really was, and I tell you what, that's actually probably a good exit. So I really thought we would get a little bit more into that, but we've got two really nice Pope and Young pronghorns on the ground now. We kind of carried everybody up to that point. Let's leave this one at that, and we'll come back and we'll get on another one of these, and we'll finish out that story, and maybe we can dive into a little bit more about our future plans that we have coming up here in a few months, heading back to Wyoming. What do you think?
That sounds great. Let's do it.
All right, Tom. Well, I sure do appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join me. And with that, I'm gonna call this one a wrap. So I will catch up with you soon, sir. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Well, folks, that'll just about put the wrap on episode number 8. We sure do appreciate you listening, and we hope you're enjoying Thom and I's discussion about Wyoming and our trip for Antelope back in 2016. We're going to pick this discussion up next week, so don't miss it. We've got a good bit of the adventure left, and I'm sure we'll probably spend a little bit of time talking about our return to Wyoming this fall in 2018 for mule deer on public land, a do-it-yourself hunt. So we're excited about that, and I'm pretty sure we'll get into that a little bit next week. Also, don't forget, get entered for the drawing for the 5-weight fly rod and reel combo that we're giving away. That drawing is scheduled for the 14th of May. So re-listen to this episode for the intro notes about the rules, or you can visit the website at www.traditionaloutdoors.com. And we wish you all the best of luck. So until the next time, I invite everyone to get out there and enjoy our great outdoors. And if you can, as always, take a kid along. Be safe, be responsible, and be sure to set a good example for your fellow outdoors men and women. So long, everyone.